There are photographs that pass through generations without scrutiny. Images so ordinary, so unremarkable, that they're filed away in boxes, tucked between pages, or sold at estate sales for pennies. This is the story of one such photograph, taken in 1906, somewhere in rural Pennsylvania, of a babysitter and the infant in her care. The photograph itself is typical of the era. A woman sits rigidly in a wooden chair, her posture straight, her expression neutral. She wears a high-collared blouse with delicate stitching, her hair pinned back severely. Her hands rest on the baby in her lap, a small child, perhaps 6 months old, dressed in white cotton and lace. The background is plain, slightly overexposed, the way most parlor photographs were in those days when natural light was scarce and exposure times stretched long. For nearly a century, this photograph existed without question. It was discovered in 2004, tucked inside a leather-bound family Bible sold at an estate auction in Lancaster County. The buyer, a collector of Victorian ephemera, nearly overlooked it. The image was faded, the corners worn soft. There were no names written on the back, no dates, no inscriptions, just two figures frozen in time, staring into the lens of a box camera that no longer exists. The collector cataloged it alongside dozens of other anonymous portraits. Faces without stories, moments without context. It might have stayed that way forever, but something about the photograph lingered. Not the babysitter, whose face was plain and forgettable. Not the setting, which was identical to 1,000 other domestic portraits of the period. It was something else. Something that only became visible when someone finally looked closely enough. It wasn't the babysitter people kept staring at. It was the baby. In 2009, a digital restoration specialist named Margaret Holt was hired to preserve a collection of early American photographs. Among them was the 1906 image of the babysitter and child. Holt's process was meticulous. She scanned each photograph at high resolution, correcting for fading, adjusting contrast, and sharpening details that had blurred over decades of handling and storage. When she magnified the babysitter photograph, the screen filled with textures invisible to the naked eye, the weave of the fabric, the grain of the wooden chair, the individual hairs escaping the woman's tight bun. But it was the baby's face that stopped her. Early photography was unforgiving. Exposure times required stillness, and infants rarely cooperated. It was common for babies in Victorian portraits to appear blurred or wide-eyed, caught mid-motion or startled by the flash powder. But this child was perfectly still, too still. And the expression, it wasn't the blank contentment of an infant at rest. It was something else entirely. Holt zoomed further. The baby's eyes were open, fixed not on the camera but slightly to the left, as though focused on something just outside the frame. The mouth was not relaxed. The lips were pressed together, the tiny chin slightly dimpled with tension. And the hands, small fists clenched against the babysitter's arm, fingers curled tight. Holt called in a colleague, a historian specializing in Victorian child-rearing practices. They studied the image together. The colleague pointed out the positioning. The baby was not cradled. The babysitter's hands were not supportive. They were restraining. One hand gripped the child's upper arm, fingers pressing into the soft cotton sleeve. The other hand rested heavily across the baby's chest, holding the child in place. This wasn't motion blur. This wasn't a fidgety infant caught mid-squirm. This was a baby being held down. And whatever was happening in that room, in that moment, the camera had captured it. The search for identity began with the photograph itself. Researchers examined every visible detail, the style of the blouse, the construction of the chair, the faint pattern on the wallpaper behind them. All pointed to the mid-1900s, likely somewhere in Pennsylvania or southern New York. But without names or context, the investigation required deeper digging. Census records from 1900 to 1910 were combed for households employing live-in help or domestic caregivers. Parish records, employment registries, and city directories were cross-referenced. Researchers focused on families with infants during that period, particularly those who might have hired temporary care. But the babysitter's face yielded nothing. Her features were too common, her clothing too typical. She could have been anyone, and perhaps that was the point, because as the search continued, a troubling pattern emerged. In multiple census records from Lancaster County and surrounding areas, researchers found listings for families with young children, households where neighbors, servants, and even extended relatives were carefully documented. But in several cases, there were unexplained gaps. Women listed as housekeepers or help with no surnames. Employment advertisements in local newspapers seeking caregivers, posted repeatedly by the same families. References to temporary arrangements with no follow-up documentation. One family in particular stood out. The Caldwell household, residing at 47 Maple Street in a small mill town outside Philadelphia. In the 1905 census, the family included a father, a mother, 3 older children, and an infant daughter named Grace. Neighbors were listed. A boarder in the adjoining home was named. But the caregiver, described only as domestic help, had no entry. By 1910, the census listed the same family. But Grace was no longer among them. No death certificate was found. No burial record. Just an absence where a child had been. And the babysitter, whoever she was, had vanished from every official document. Historians began to suspect that this woman was never meant to be documented. Whether by design or by the nature of her work, she existed in the margins of record-keeping, hired quietly, dismissed without trace, moving from household to household without ever leaving her name behind. The investigation pivoted to the Caldwell family. Property records confirmed their residence at 47 Maple Street from 1903 to 1912. The father, Thomas Caldwell, worked as a foreman at a local textile mill. The mother, Evelyn, had no listed occupation, typical for women of her class and era. The household appeared respectable, modest but stable. Nothing about their public records suggested tragedy or scandal. But beneath the surface, a pattern emerged that could no longer be ignored. Grace, the infant photographed in 1906, was the 5th child born to Evelyn Caldwell. But only 3 children were listed in the 1910 census. The first child, a son named Robert, had died in 1899 at the age of 2. Cause of death: pneumonia. The third child, a daughter named Margaret, had died in 1902 at 18 months. Cause of death: fever. In that era, infant mortality was heartbreakingly common. 1 in 5 children did not survive past their 5th birthday. Pneumonia, diphtheria, scarlet fever. These were familiar killers. But the spacing of the deaths, the repeated losses within one household, raised questions. Medical records from the period were sparse, but a local physician's ledger, preserved in a county historical society, included entries for the Caldwell home. Multiple visits between 1901 and 1906. Treatments for failure to thrive. Notes describing malnourishment and unexplained bruising. In one entry, dated March 1906, the physician wrote, "Mother reports child refuses food. Child appears lethargic, unresponsive to stimuli." The terminology of the era often masked the truth. Failure to thrive could mean neglect. Lethargic and unresponsive could indicate untreated illness, or something darker. And the fact that the doctor continued to visit, continued to document concerns, suggested that something in that household was wrong. Neighbors from the time, long deceased, had left behind no formal complaints. But a descendant of a family who lived 2 doors down recalled a story her grandmother had told. The Caldwell house, she said, was known as the quiet house. Not peaceful. Quiet in a way that unsettled people. Because even with young children inside, no one ever heard them cry. In 2011, forensic specialists were brought in to analyze the photograph with modern techniques. Their focus was not on who the subjects were, but on what the image itself revealed about the moment it captured. Forensic photography experts, pediatric specialists, and behavioral analysts studied the baby's posture, facial tension, and positioning in granular detail. The findings were unsettling. The baby's hands were clenched, not in the loose, reflexive curl of a resting infant, but in tight fists, a response associated with distress or pain. The spine was rigid, the shoulders drawn upward in a defensive posture. Infants naturally mold to the person holding them, their bodies relaxed and compliant. This child's body was doing the opposite. It was resisting. The baby's face told an even more disturbing story. The eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on a point beyond the camera. Specialists compared the gaze to documented cases of dissociation in traumatized children, a detachment from the immediate environment, a shutting down of response. The mouth, pressed into a thin line, showed tension in the surrounding muscles. This was not a child momentarily uncomfortable. This was a child in sustained distress. And then there was the babysitter's grip. Under magnification, the positioning of her hands became impossible to ignore. Her left hand, wrapped around the baby's upper arm, was pressing down with enough force to create visible indentation in the fabric. Her right hand, splayed across the baby's chest, was not cradling. It was pinning. The angle of her fingers, the rigidity of her wrist, all indicated deliberate control. One forensic pediatric specialist, reviewing the enhanced image, provided a written analysis that reshaped the entire investigation. Her conclusion was direct and clinical. This child is not being held. This child is being restrained. The physiological indicators present in this image are consistent with acute distress and sustained physical coercion. The photograph was no longer a family keepsake. It was evidence. Evidence of a moment when something was happening to this child. Something that required force to maintain. Something that could not be allowed to interrupt the stillness required by the camera. Oral histories, when they survive, often carry truths that official records bury. In 2013, a researcher conducting interviews for a local heritage project spoke with an elderly woman named Clara Dennison, whose grandmother had lived on Maple Street in the early 1900s. What Clara shared, reluctantly, had been passed down through whispers. A story her grandmother never told publicly, but never forgot. The Caldwell household, Clara explained, had always employed help. Young women, often newly arrived from rural areas, hired to assist with the children and household work. But the turnover was constant. A girl would arrive, stay a few weeks, and then leave suddenly. No explanations, no references, just gone. The community, tightly knit and watchful, noticed. But in 1906, accusing a respectable family of wrongdoing was a serious matter. Women who worked as domestics had little power and less credibility. If they left without notice, it was assumed they were unreliable. If they made complaints, they were seen as troublemakers. And so the pattern continued. Clara's grandmother recalled one particular afternoon in late spring, 1906. She had been walking past the Caldwell house when she heard crying. Not the ordinary fussing of a child, but a sustained, desperate wail that stopped abruptly. Moments later, the babysitter emerged from the front door, pale and shaken, and walked quickly down the street. She never returned. Local newspapers from the period contained no scandal, no investigations. But the classified advertisements told a different story. Between 1904 and 1907, the Caldwells placed ads seeking household help at least 7 times, an unusually high frequency. Each ad was nearly identical. Seeking experienced girl for childcare. Must be discreet and dependable. The word discreet appeared in several other households' advertisements as well. Historians began to recognize it as code, a signal that the work involved circumstances the family did not want discussed. What those circumstances were, the records did not say. But the pattern of rapid turnover, sudden departures, and repeated hiring suggested an environment where caregivers either could not or would not stay. And in the center of it all was the photograph. The babysitter with no name, the baby with no future, and a silence that stretched across generations. By 2014, the evidence had converged into a portrait of systematic abuse. The photograph, once dismissed as an ordinary domestic portrait, was now understood as something far more damning. A frozen moment of coercion, captured not because anyone intended to document a crime, but because the camera had been pointed in the wrong direction at the wrong time. The babysitter's identity remained unknown, but her role had become clear. She was not a family member or a trusted caregiver. She was hired help, likely vulnerable, likely desperate for work, and likely complicit, either through fear or indifference, in whatever was happening in that household. The baby, Grace Caldwell, had no voice in 1906, and by 1910, she had no presence in any record at all. Researchers theorized multiple possibilities. Grace may have died from neglect or untreated illness, her death recorded under a false cause or not recorded at all. She may have been sent away, placed with relatives or institutions and erased from family history. Or she may have survived, but carried scars, physical and psychological, that followed her into an anonymous adulthood. What is certain is that no charges were ever filed. No investigation was launched. The The Caldwell family continued to live on Maple Street until 1912, when they relocated to another state. Thomas Caldwell's employment records showed steady work. Evelyn Caldwell's name appeared in church registries and social club minutes. They were, by all outward appearances, a respectable family. The photograph remained hidden in that Bible for nearly a century, and when it finally surfaced, it carried with it a truth that had been waiting all along. The camera, indifferent to intention, had interrupted something. The baby's body, the babysitter's grip, the tension frozen in that single exposure. All of it pointed to one conclusion. This was not a portrait. It was evidence. Evidence of a crime that no one investigated, that no one acknowledged, and that history nearly erased entirely. The only reason we know about it now is because someone, somewhere, decided to look more closely. Grace Caldwell was never seen again after 1908. No burial plot bears her name. No marriage certificate or employment record carries her forward into adulthood. She exists only in fragments: a census entry, a physician's note, and this photograph. The image remains in a private collection, studied occasionally by historians and forensic specialists, but never publicly displayed. It is too disturbing, too intimate, too much a window into suffering that cannot be undone. But it serves as a reminder. How many other photographs exist in attics, in albums, in estate sales, hiding truths no one thought to question? How many children, like Grace, were documented not because someone cared, but because the camera happened to be there? And how many lives, ordinary and unremarkable in their presentation, concealed violence that never reached the courtroom or the headlines? The crime hidden in this photograph was not an anomaly. It was a product of its time, a time when children had few protections, when domestic workers had no recourse, and when the appearance of respectability was more important than the truth. The babysitter, whoever she was, likely moved on to another household, another family, another child. And Grace, wherever she went, carried the weight of that moment for the rest of her life, if she lived long enough to carry it at all. The photograph endures because it refuses to let us forget. It is not a memory. It is a confession, a silent testimony from a child who had no other way to speak. And if we look closely enough, if we're willing to see what the camera saw, then perhaps we can do what no one did in 1906. We can bear witness. We can say her name. We can remember that Grace Caldwell existed, and that what happened to her mattered. Even now, even after all this time, some photographs don't show history. They confess it.